Okay, happy Monday. I think it's a Monday for you guys. Today it's Friday when I'm recording this, but it should be a Monday, and hopefully by now you realize what our test and quizzes are like. So last week you had a test on Friday, you had a quiz on Wednesday, and hopefully you're getting an idea of what our assessments are like. And so I think it's really important for me to tell you before I kind of start this lecture on cell structures is to look at the notes that are in the modules. Make sure you print them off. Make sure you have them. The other thing that's really important, and hopefully you came to my conference last week, but the other thing that's going to be really important are these. They're called unit handouts, and they look like this. They usually have a table in the top, and they have short answers on the bottom. This is included at the beginning of every unit. You need to memorize the things, the prefixes and suffixes that are at the top of this handout. The reason is because biology, a lot of your hints and a lot of your clues for what different things mean are based on their prefixes and suffixes and their root words. So you could do a couple different things with this information because it's going to be on every one of your quizzes. You could make flashcards. You could put it in Quizlet, which is so-so. Some people do really well with Quizlet, and some people just put it in there, but it doesn't really help. Don't do anything that doesn't help. Okay, so if you just put it in Quizlet and you're not learning the material, make flashcards, write them down, have friends go back and forth, or parents or siblings go back and forth to learn prefixes and suffixes of each unit. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit. If you have questions, please let me know, but I want you to get an idea of how best and how to be smarter, not harder when you're working. I want to make sure that you're spending your time wisely and not spending a lot of time studying in ways that don't help you. Everybody learns differently. Everybody, a lot of my students, a lot of you guys are sketchers and drawers, and for this unit especially, you could draw out the cells in like anime fashion or like manga. You know, I told you, and some of you guys, I sketch too. When I have you in class, you'll see that a lot. But you could draw it out in like a comic strip. You could draw out the cells and put what they do, the organelles and what they do. So there's lots of different ways to study to help you get ready for these quizzes and tests that you're going to have every couple of weeks. And remember, major grades are 70% of your class grade. So that's going to be really important. Today we're talking about cell structure. So what you have to do is you as a student have to be able to compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, including their complexity. So that's talking about the organelles that are inside and what they do. And so behind me, I put them up here, and I don't know how much I'll reference them. I also have a really old, probably from the 1970s, prokaryotic cell. I have some smaller cells that I'm going to show you. I wish you were in my class because we could talk about it a little bit better, but we're going to do our best. All right, so let's get started. What I want you to know about all cells are a couple different things. Our bodies have approximately 10 trillion cells in them. Our bodies, when cells die, we're constantly like making new cells, and our bodies constantly are working to make new cells. So that's really important. Cells carry out basic life functions like growth, reproduction, and responses to environment. So that's important. Blood is made of cells that carry oxygen and carbon dioxide to other cells. And we're going to go into later mitosis and meiosis and how cells reproduce. And so those things, I just want you to know kind of the basic things about cells. Cells are so important. I know we talk about biomolecules and those being kind of the building blocks of cells, but a lot of times cells are considered the basic units of living things. Okay, and one of the things we talked about a couple weeks ago was water. And water comprises so much of every living thing. You have to have water to have living things, which is why we talked about it. Cells, kind of the same thing. It's in all living things, whether it's a unicellular organism and it's only made of one cell, or it's a multicellular organism and it's made of a lot of cells. So cells are still the basic unit of life. Okay, hopefully my computer will work. Please go to the next slide. Okay, so the history of the microscope. The reason I'm telling you this, and if you had me in 6th grade, we did this a little bit. The reason we're talking about the history of the microscope is because we wouldn't know that cells exist if we don't have a microscope. So Anton von Leeuwenhoek designed the first microscope, and it looked like that, which is nothing like the microscopes now. That was in the 1600s. And then we have Robert Hooke in 1665. He used a microscope to examine a thin slice of cork. So cork is a plant. And so when you look at plants under a microscope, they look like this. They look like squares or rectangles, and you're going to find out why, hopefully, during this lesson. What he saw looked like small boxes, so he called them cells, kind of like gel cells. That's why they're like small boxes, so he called them cells. So that's important. Slyden and Swan stated that plants and animals are made of cells. And so these are the two guys who are credited with this whole big theory called cell theory. And we've talked about theories in the past, but here's a very important one, cell theory, and there's three components to cell theory. And those components are that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. The cell is the basic unit of organization of living things. And then all cells come from pre-existing cells. So cells don't just go poof. They come from pre-existing cells. It's kind of like the law of conservation of mass and the law of conservation of energy. Things don't just poof out of air. They come from pre-existing other things, and they replicate, and that's when we're going to get into mitosis and meiosis later. So these are the three basic concepts of cell theory. Make sure you know this. Make sure you kind of memorize this. Memorize this for the test and quiz that'll happen next week, okay? So let's talk about eukaryotic versus prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotes, the beginning of pro, that prefix pro, means before, and kary means nucleus. So if you have this piece of paper and it has all of the prefixes and suffixes you need to memorize for this unit, you'll see that pro means before and kary means nucleus. So a nucleus is kind of the command center of the cell, and we're going to talk about that later, but prokaryotes are before there's a nucleus. So what that means is prokaryotes do not have a nucleus, and prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles, but they're still cells. So they still replicate, they still reproduce, they still carry out basic functions. So they still have organelles, so to speak, but they're not bound by membranes. They're not separated specifically. So prokaryotes are the oldest, most primitive cells, and they're usually, actually they're always more simple than eukaryotic cells. So here's an example of a prokaryote. It's a sad example from, I think, 1970s or so. So this one has a couple of different things. This one has the DNA. It's not in a nucleus, though. See, it's kind of all just shredded about in the middle. It still has cytoplasm, which is this blue stuff. In your diagram on your picture, which I'm pointing to, but y'all can see, it still has a cell wall, and it still has a membrane, but it's kind of in like this capsule-like thing. It has these kind of things that are called pili, sometimes cilia, it's called that. And then it has this really long, weird-looking thing. It's called a flagella, okay? And that's all. These cells move around, usually in water-like substances, okay? So if you collected pond water for Miss Gom in 6th grade, or you collected pond water for some kind of experiment, you had bacterial cells in it, and these are those kind of cells, okay? And so they have to move through the water. You may have seen cilia where they kind of through the water. So those are prokaryotic cells. They're very simple. They're not more than, so when I talk about prokaryotic cells, you can only see these, except for this nasty thing, you can only see these with a microscope. You can't go, oh, look, you're a prokaryotic cell. They're so simple that they can't make bigger things. Anything you can see with your eyes, even like a mushroom or even a plant or even a bug, those have to be made out of eukaryotic cells because prokaryotic cells are so simple. Okay, eukaryotic cells. These are larger and more complex, and these are what make multicellular organisms. Okay, so eukaryotic cells because they have so many different membrane-bound organelles and they're so complex, those are the things that can make multicellular organisms like you and me, or like plants, or like bugs. Or if you have a microscope, this is unicellular, but the protista and paramecium are very complex eukaryotic one-celled organisms. But if you can see something with your eyes, if you're looking outside and you can see an ant, that has to be a eukaryotic cell because it's had the chance to get bigger. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, yes. That the EU, again, from your unit check sheet, EU means true nucleus. It has a true nucleus. And they do have membrane-bound organelles, which make them more complex. So they have an organelle, ELLE means small. An organelle are small structures, small organs. That's the suffix ELLE. They're small organs, so they're small structures that perform very special functions, and that's how they can get very complex. All right, let's talk about that. Oh, I just messed that up, didn't I? Now I'm just going all over the place. Okay, on the bottom is an animal cell. It's round. I'm going to go to the next one, though. So that is a very complex cell. That's an animal cell in a picture. And so what does that mean? That's a eukaryotic cell. All the organelles are within themselves. They're very compact. They're very within a membrane. So that's a eukaryotic cell. Here's a plant cell. Look, it looks like a rectangle. It looks like those cells that Robert Hooke called cells. The reason is because of the cell wall that has a very specific structure. There are some differences between animal and plant cells besides just that one's rectangle and one's circle, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the slideshow. So this right here, the question is it a prokaryote or eukaryote? Well, it's a prokaryote because the DNA or the plasmid, whichever one we're using here, the chromosomes are not in a nucleus. They're not in like a ball or a center. Okay, so that's a prokaryotic cell. There's two types of prokaryotic cells, or two kingdoms of prokaryotic cells. There's archaeobacteria and there's eubacteria, and you should have already learned this, but archaeobacteria are single-celled prokaryotic cells that don't need oxygen. So they're like methanogens that just use methane, or they're there's halogens which just use salt to live. But then there's regular bacterial cells that need oxygen. So like in our gut, when you hear about probiotics and stuff like that, we have regular bacterial cells that hang out with our other cells, and we kind of have this symbiotic relationship where it keeps our gut healthy. I know that's weird. Sorry. Okay, so prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cell, these are the similarities. So they both have plasma membranes. They both have cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the gel-filled stuff in between. And the next slide or the next few slides will go over specifically what cytoplasm is. They both have DNA, so they both can replicate. But in a eukaryotic cell, it's within this condensed membrane. In a prokaryotic cell, it's just kind of floating there in the middle, just kind of hanging out. And then they both have ribosomes. Okay, the prokaryotic cell is smaller, which y'all may or may not know what these units are, but a eukaryotic cell goes from 0.1 to 10, that size, and then the eukaryotic cell is a lot bigger because it's more complex. Okay, so before I go into all the organelles and what they do, I want to talk about the endosymbiotic theory. So our world began, our Earth began, and there was cyanobacteria. There wasn't a lot of oxygen when we first began our Earth, okay, 4.6 million years ago. When we began, and our layers of our Earth kind of restacked themselves or kind of adjusted themselves based on density. So at first we were just like one fiery ball of metal, and then over time the most dense materials went to the center because we still spun. The most dense materials went to the center, and so that's why you have the nickel and iron right there in the core, and then and then the other materials kind of sectioned out based on their density. So the least materials sit on the top, on the crust. And so on this crust, at the very beginning of time, there wasn't oxygen. So that's why they believe that archaeobacteria formed at that time. Archaeobacteria, this bacteria that doesn't need oxygen. And that cyanobacteria formed, and this is a long story, and if you're in my class, we'd talk about it, but back in the day, there was only prokaryotic cells. There weren't humans walking around 4.6 million years ago. No, we didn't have there were prokaryotes. And what they believe is, this theory, endosymbiotic theory, is that two prokaryotes were kind of hanging out, and one of the prokaryotes ate or engulfed or folded in another prokaryote. And when that happened, this outside prokaryote became an outside cell, and this inside prokaryote became its own thing, and they believe that it became mitochondria, because mitochondria has its own DNA. Okay, so if these two prokaryotes are hanging out, yay, I'm hanging out, and then one eats the other, kind of like Pac-Man, then you have this aerobic bacteria that gets eaten inside. Aerobic means it needs oxygen. It eats it up, and it becomes this more complex cell, and then all of a sudden it morphs into something more complex, and they start working together. And so they believe that eukaryotic cells have these aerobic bacteria inside. These animal cells engulfed these aerobic bacteria, and that was what became mitochondria. And so that's how they believe that this eukaryotic cell formed at the very beginning of time, which led to evolution later, and we'll talk a lot about that. For plant cells, those two things that were kind of hanging, oh yeah, I'm hanging out. The Pac-Man that ate the other one was a photosynthetic cell, which means it was this prokaryotic cell that lives off of light. And so it was engulfed in the other cell, and it became the chloroplast of the plant cell. And we're going to talk about that later, but that's the endosymbiotic theory, was that there was a bunch of prokaryotes hanging around, and they started eating each other, basically, and and that's how we got eukaryotic cells that became more and more complex over time, which gave rise to multicellular organisms, anything from humans to mushrooms to animals to plants. Plants are eukaryotic cells. Okay, they're multicellular eukaryotic cells. All right. So there are different types of organelles, and you need to know these types of organelles and what they do. Okay, so you need to know what it is and what it does. And okay, the first one is the cytoplasm. So inside this cell, there's this blue part that they didn't color any differently. And here's the green one. They didn't cut, this one's kind of broken. They didn't color it any differently. It's the stuff it's kind of filler. Okay, it's your negative space. You have it in prokaryotic cells too. It's this light blue. That is cytoplasm. So it's all the filler material. It's the gel-like portion of the cell outside the nucleus. It surrounds all the organelles. So it's on the outside of all the organelles. And it has important chemical reactions that happen in it. But it's the filler around all the organelles that kind of keep the organelles in place. So here's a picture of the cytoplasm on a 2D model. Just that tan material. So I'm going to say this: if you were to have Jello, and you put something in the Jello, okay, but you had Jello all around, and then like you put a stapler in it, or if you went to the office, or you put other things in it in the Jello, all the Jello that's going around that other material is kind of like cytoplasm. Okay, the nucleus. Yay, nucleus. This is the difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. The nucleus, it is this, in the plant cell and the animal cell, it's a very round, when you look at it at a microscope, it's an oval shape. It contains all the genetic material inside eukaryotic cells. It has a membrane, so that's important. It contains all the genetic material. When you look at it under a microscope, you can actually see it, especially when they dye it. But there are two parts of the nucleus. There's the chromatin, which is the strands of DNA that condense to form chromosomes during mitosis. Again, we'll talk about that later. And then there's the nucleus. It's the site of ribosome formation. The big thing I want you to know about the nucleus is the command center. So if we're talking about a school, it's kind of like the principal's office. Dr. Morrill's office is the command center of the cell, of the school. Okay, the nucleus is like that. It decides everything else that's going to happen outside of it. Okay, so that's a good analogy for a nucleus. And you're actually going to do a project with it later this week, so just kind of keep that in mind. Excuse me. So here's a picture of a cell nucleus. You see the chromosomes, and they're going to become really important in biology later. You see chromatin, and those are just free floating. But that's a picture of the nucleus. There are nuclear pores. Things do have to come in and out of the nucleus, but it's restricted access. All right. The next thing we're going to talk about are ribosomes. They are found in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and they're usually just circles. They're just circles. See? Okay. They're circles. It's the site of protein synthesis. So our biomolecules we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. They're protein. We have to make protein with amino acids, right? That's the monomers of proteins are amino acids, and we have to have something that makes these proteins, and those are ribosomes. You have to have them. So they're in both prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. The next thing is endoplasmic reticulum. That is a little complicated, but I'll tell you a good analogy for it in a minute. The endoplasmic reticulum, there are two different types. There are some that have like little dots on them. Those are rough endoplasmic reticulum. See the little dots right here? That is a rough endoplasmic reticulum. And then there are some that are smooth with no dots. If they have dots on them, those are ribosomes. See the purple dots? If they don't have dots, they don't have ribosomes on them. So they are the transport material. They transport material around a cell. So I kind of think of them like a conveyor belt in a factory, or maybe highways on a road. They transport things. Maybe you can think of it like a postal center. Okay. Smooth ER, so the one without the ribosomes, those are for lipid production. Remember, lipids, major energy, also lipids or insulation. Okay. So lipid production is from smooth ER, and then rough ER transports the protein. So we've got ribosomes that are for protein synthesis, and then the rough ER transports those proteins. All right. So here's another picture of them in 2D, and it just kind of gives you more detail about what they look like. They're usually attached to the nucleus. And so because they have to transport materials in and out of that nucleus. All right, Golgi apparatus. Sometimes it's called a Golgi body. These are stacked flattened membrane sacs, and they collect, modify, package, and distribute materials. So this is the one that I would be a better analogy to the post office. Let me go back real fast. Oh, now I'm just going forward. Sorry. The endoplasmic reticulum would be more like a highway or a factory or something like that. And then the Golgi apparatus or the Golgi body is more like the UPS office or the post office. Golgi bodies do all this, you have all this stuff ready to go, and they make sure it gets to the right place. They modify, package, distribute material to the final destination. So they put the finishing touches on these that I have on the board. They look like this. Okay, and then on yours they just look like that. You don't have to know all the very specific detail right now about each of these organelles. It's just that this is the Golgi apparatus or the Golgi body. Lysosomes. Lysosomes are also seen as dots on other models. Lysosome contain digestive enzymes. Enzymes are proteins. Remember, they catalyze reactions. It contains digestive enzymes that break down the macromolecules. Macromolecules is the same as biomolecules into smaller molecules, which can be used by the rest of the cell. So they're more like the stomach. They're like the digestive piece. It'll also destroy worn out cell parts and invading bacteria or viruses. They're mainly found in the animal cell. That doesn't mean all the time, but mainly in the animal cell. Okay, vacuoles. These are kind of cool. I think these are cool. Vacuoles, the vacuo means empty in your prefix suffix. I can't stress this enough how important this piece of paper is, because it kind of gives you a guideline for the quiz and the short answers for your test. But the vacuole means empty. There's a huge vacuole in the plant cell. Huge, huge. And when I say huge, it's still under a microscope. So, but it's huge. And then there's smaller ones in the animal cell. The vacuole is a space for storage for water, salts, proteins, carbohydrates. Plant cells have a really big one, a central vacuole, and animal cells have a whole bunch of smaller ones. So again, look at those prefixes on this piece of paper. I can't stress this enough. Look at those prefixes so you know what some of these words mean. So when you see them, you're not like, what am I looking at? You'll want to know. So vacuole means empty. So it's like an empty space. Mitochondria. A lot of you know this one because it's a fun word to say. Mitochondria, it changes the chemical energy stored in food into compounds that cells can use. They produce ATP, an energy storing molecule. So mitochondria, these are cool, and a lot of people think these are cool. So mitochondria look like this. So see, they have these double membranes. Okay, mitochondria. And they're known as like the powerhouse of the cell. So they give it all the power and all the running, kind of what it does. Okay, so I'm trying to think of a place they give it power. If you're in a city, the thing that powers the city would be the electrical plant, the light, the energy center point, right? So we all get our power from energy. So that's kind of an analogy if you were talking about a city. So they're the powerhouse of the cell. They produce the ATP, which is energy. All right, chloroplasts. These are in some protista, but they're really in plant cells. If you look at your cheat sheet, your handy dandy cheat sheet, chloro means green, and it transforms light energy into sugar or glucose. All living things need sugar of some sort, whether it's ATP, whether it's glucose. That's how we survive and live. That's our food. We're the only species that actually want our food to taste good. I guess my dog does too, but she's cute. We're the only species that's like, hey, what's up? Like, let's go eat at Torchy's and have a good time. Most species, and including plants or whatever, it's just to get this energy. So when they eat food, it's just to get the energy they need to do something else. That's because of sugar. We need sugar. So, you don't see a bunch of jaguars hanging out laughing over at Torchy's eating chips and guac, right? So they just eat enough that meat that they're carnivores, I think. So I know they are. They're eating that meat to get enough energy, ATP in their cells, or to be able to do their functions. So chloroplasts are in the plants. So they take in light through photosynthesis. Photo is light. And they produce that sugar that's needed for plants to do their function. Everything has a function. It contains chlorophyll, a green pigment that traps the radiant light. That's why they're green. And I think there's okay there. See, this is the 2D model of it here. Again, you don't have to know all the little tiny details right now of this. We will later, but right now, just kind of get the overarching idea of what it does. The cytoskeleton. So the cytoskeleton is kind of what it sounds like. Cytoskeleton holds something up or supports the cell. Cyto means cell, and then skeleton is a skeleton. So it's the cell skeleton. Cyto is prefix, means cell. So it acts as scaffolding that helps support and maintain the shape of the cell. They form centrioles, an organelle that help eukaryotic cells during cell division. So centrioles, I don't know if I go through this later on the slide or not, but centrioles are in the cell for support too. And we'll just leave it at that. Okay, cell membranes. These are going to be huge in our next unit, or the next few units. But right now, just know that the cell membrane controls materials that enter and exit the cell. We're going to learn a whole lot about how these are formed and the different pieces of cell membranes. But right now, Just know that they have different processes that decide what can come in or out of the cell. They maintain homeostasis. So stasis is the suffix stasis is position, and homo means same, or homeo means same. So it's the same position. So it wants to be balanced or equal. All living things, all systems, the whole purpose of all systems is to be balanced. The cell membrane maintains balance in the cell. It's made of a flexible phospholipid. There's your lipid again. Phospholipid bilayer. And we're going to, you don't have to know that right now. We're going to really go into that, later. The cell wall. The cell wall is found in plants, algae, fungi, and prokaryotic cells. It keeps its structure outside the cell, and it protects some cells. But that's why when you look at microscopic views of plant cells, they look like rectangles, okay? They're composed of complex carbohydrates. So in plant cells, it's cellulose, and in fungi cells, it's called chitin. I might be saying that wrong, but I don't think so. But they're kind of cool because when Robert Hooke saw those cells, or if you were to look at a plant cell, they look like that's why you have stems, right? You have stems and leaves. That's why you have stems of flowers, because these cell walls are so rigid that they keep the stem of the rose or whatever you have, the stem of the flower, straight like it is. I don't know. Cool information. Okay. What's the difference between a plant and an animal cell? Plant cells are generally larger and more rectangular than animal cells. So plant cell, okay, it's just, and I know the light on my board, it's annoying, but plant cells are usually larger and they're rectangular because of the cell wall. Plant cells contain chloroplast and large central vacuoles. And plant cells have a cell wall. Animal cells don't, which is why they're more round. They're not as structured. You know, I don't have my arm is not a stem of a plant where I can't move it, okay? Animal cells have more fluidity, or the ability to kind of, I don't know, move around. Animal cells have centrioles and lysosomes, and plants do not. So that's important. Centrioles were helping with structure. So hopefully that helps and makes sense. All right, so there's a plant cell in 2D and there's an animal cell. We're going to do tomorrow some coloring with it if you're here with me. Hopefully you'll be here with me, some of you. And then if you're at home, you'll do kind of a digital activity. I like to color. I like to draw and sketch, and like I said earlier, so we're going to do a lot of, coloring and sketching and stuff like that in the class. And so if you're with me tomorrow, we're going to do a coloring sheet on cell function and kind of color by number. So that's exciting. All right, that's the end of the slideshow. So if you have questions, please ask. Please ask. That's why I'm here. Hopefully I'm getting to meet some of you now this week. I look forward to it. I'm excited that you're here. I only get you for like 46 minutes here in high school, so that's kind of sad. But that's okay. I'm excited to see you every day. Please don't forget the unit handouts. And also, not only do I have notes that you can watch with me, but you also have printable notes of the same slideshow that you can print out at home. And there's a button, hopefully you figure this out, where you can do 6 slides on one page and save printer paper. But that way you have all the hard copy of notes. Everybody on online learning, and even those who are coming in, have hard copy of notes in the modules for every day that we go over them. So it may have an assignment, but above the assignment, it'll have a hard copy of those notes, and it'll have me talking over the hard copy of notes. So you have kind of a lot of different ways to get notes. And you also have the unit handouts at the beginning of the week or the beginning of a new unit. So if there's no more questions, I will talk to you later. Well, actually, you can't ask questions now, but please email me or Google Voice me if you have any questions at all. All right. I hope to see you soon. I hope to see some of you this week. I am really looking forward to it. Bye.